We'd like to do one more recognition before Brian introduces our keynote speaker today. I should introduce, for those of you who don't know, I'm Jody Miller. This is Mike Lynch, our president of the board, and this is Brian Roberts, our president-elect. So you have the three here that are, one has the biggest smile on her face. That would be me.
She's not going anywhere.
We would like to recognize our outgoing board members at this time. We have 4 people who, through the term limiting process, are rolling off of the board of directors and have been all very great contributors to the board and to the association, and each of them have their specific areas of talent and skill that they have contributed to NATOA. Todd Barnes from Colorado helped with our newly formed communications committee and getting our regular newsletter off the ground, among other things. Sue Buskey, who was involved in several different areas, but one of the big extras that she contributed is helping with our strategic plan and actually leading our board planning retreat in the winter and helping get that report and keeping us on track throughout the year. Keith Reeves leads in the programming area, takes care of our wonderful GPA awards competition with his committee, and helps plan the programming track and the storytelling workshop for this conference, so just does an amazing job. And of course, as you heard yesterday, our past president, who's now completing his term, Tony Perez, who was recognized yesterday with a Member of the Year award. So would the 4 of you please come up, and as Mike said, you're not going anywhere, but thank you very much for your service. Okay, stand right up here. Someone take a picture so we can tweet it later. You guys line up for an applause right in the front of the stage. Somebody out there take a picture so we can tweet it later. Okay.
Keith must be working.
Keith is working.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for today, and that is Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee. She is joining us from the Brookings Institution Center for Technology Innovation. She's a contributor to the Brookings Institution Science and Technology blog, Tech Tank, that you can take a look at. She researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the United States and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Her research explores global and domestic broadband deployment, regulatory and internet governance issues. She's an expert on the intersection of race, wealth, technology within the context of civic engagement, criminal justice, and economic development. Prior to joining Brookings, she served as Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, the MMTC, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and preserving equal opportunity and civil rights and the mass media, telecommunications, and broadband industries. And Dr. Turner-Lee, let's see, we're thrilled to have her here today. She's a much sought-after speaker. And a longtime friend of NATOA, so sharing her thoughts on and wisdom about tech disruption, public policies, and the digital divide. Please welcome Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I go to a Baptist church out in Virginia, and we do good afternoons. We turn to our neighbor, as my preacher says, and says, glad to see you. So turn to your neighbor and say, glad to see you. I am just thrilled to speak at NATOA as I look around and see many old friends and people who basically were very instrumental early on in my career. I cannot say how humbled I am to address this group. Particularly since there's so much going on in Washington, D.C., I cannot say how happy I am to actually leave Washington and come across the country and speak to different people. I want to extend a special thanks out to Jody. I want to say thank you to Mike, to Brian for that wonderful introduction, to Steve and Joanne, all people that I've just known for years. And as I said, this is not an organization that has not played a critical role in my advancement as a professional interested in advancing technology. I see Chris over there, just it's a crew of us that seem to convene around these issues over the years. And there's no better time to actually talk about technology, disruption, and opportunities. And I say that all in one sentence and all in one breath. Just yesterday, and I know that everybody in this room has heard about it, because if you haven't wanted one, somebody in your household does. Apple just released the next version of the iPhone. And what I found very interesting about this next version, if I may indulge you, it's pretty hilarious. It's got facial recognition that apparently failed yesterday during the demo. That was tweeted out by somebody who was probably not supposed to tell us. It integrates artificial intelligence, has wireless charging capacities, and allows for 3D video and photo streaming and imaging. That phone is not cheap. So I know when my daughter, who is 10, asked me if she could actually upgrade to that one, I said a simple, are you crazy? Because that phone is actually going to be in the range of $1,000. And I ask all of you in here a simple question, and I'm never going to tell you my age, but did you ever think that you would see a telephone hit the marketplace, as kids would say, so souped up with all those things? And let's not forget, the Apple iPhone was just introduced 7 years ago, right? I don't know, and I'm not gonna tell anybody to admit this, because there are some people who probably have this. 7 years ago, most of us were carrying flip phones. And if you still have one, God bless you. We're not gonna tell you what you're missing. And in fact, we'll probably envy you because you're less addicted to your phone. But if you think about it, technology has really changed. I mean, fast forward to today, and the world is now driven by what could be considered hyper-innovation. There are connected cars, drones, brains that are not necessarily our own, automated services that make groceries as easy as buying an airbed in the same transaction. That's the Amazon Whole Food. Online media has surpassed the attention and interest of billions of users. Facebook just announced a couple of months ago, 2.2 billion users access their social media site, and it's growing. Twitter has become the place to receive news in real time, even though some of it may be fake. And it's also the place to check the conscience and the daily behavior of a man that sits in the White House. We used to hail a cab by raising our hand, and now we get a ride by putting in an app. That's called Uber and Lyft. There was a time when we wanted to actually book a hotel room, but thanks to the genius of two college kids who were broke, who rented their air mattress, we now have Airbnb. Now, I tell the young people when I talk to them about technology, there's probably only one interactive game that I could actually beat them at, and that's Pac-Man and Mario Brothers, because that's about the only thing I know how to play. But the world of interactive gaming has even surpassed the imagination that all of us in this room had. I don't want to stick on this point, but I do have to share. You remember when we used to run home and watch the Jetsons and the Flintstones and all those other places? The Flintstones was like this archaic, back in the Stone Ages. Then there was the Jetsons, where they would just get in their car, or if you remember for the ladies, her hair was always perfect, right? Because she managed to just do stuff. The capsule created the dinner. I think that's coming soon, right? But these innovations were beyond our wildest imagination. And that disruption has actually brought us both good, and then there's been other things that are not so good about disruption. The Experian hack of 143 million people is starting to show us just how much this disruption has vulnerabilities that actually affect real people. Those are challenges. The possibility of having a cyber security attack on a connected vehicle threatens the whole defense paradigm of what is safe. So we're in this moment, my friends, where that disruption is actually accruing for all of us, this economic development capacity, this intellectual capital opportunity, while at the same time, permissionless innovation, as I tell people, has sort of played off of this paradigm, which is forgive me now, or I'll ask for forgiveness later, right? Because they don't even know what's actually happening with some of the new stuff that's being introduced into the marketplace. But given that innovation, it's important for us to think about how that affects the future of work as well. Working on an article right now for a member of Congress where they've been very interested in what does that look like. Nordstrom's just introduced yesterday a store without clothes. And when we look at opportunities like that, the only thing that comes to mind is a store without workers. Collaborative remote work environments are soon going to replace traditional in the office 9 to 5. That's interesting. That's disruptive. And that's going to impact people. Cities seeking economic and social capital will have no choice to adapt to these trends and find ways to build the capacities of their people. Smarter infrastructure, which I know has been discussed at the conference, will allow for the better management of public facilities, intelligent infrastructure design, improved transit systems, public surveillance, and even more coordinated internal government services. I found this slide. I don't have a lot of slides. I have one slide that I want to show you, but it blew my mind when it looked at the future of smart cities. Take a look at that noise. That's actually going to be enabled through the power of technology. Happy, safe, healthy citizens, utilities, enterprises, government services, and on the periphery, all of the impacts that will actually be given to people who take advantage of this. At the same time, government services, and again on the flip side, will soon be flagged via algorithms, which again is another question mark that we have to put before us, where they will find us first before we find them. Another challenge of technology. And in all of this excitement, my friends, of next generation technology and the digital sprawl, I call this sprawl, right? The demarcation between those that have access and do not becomes bigger. You could take that slide down for just a moment. And in particular, they take me to a place where we need to begin to think about the public provision of the internet. So a lot of our discussion and what I talked about earlier is about the commercial side of the internet. I even talk about video, right, and what video has done. We're no longer looking at TV, we're looking at it on our phones. That is the exact reason why I'm wearing these glasses today, because I can't see with all the new technology. At the same token, we're at a place that we have to ensure that people have ubiquitous access. And as I stand here, I'm reminded of my own personal story. I started in the technology industry a long time ago. I've never worked in the private sector, but I've been what's called a digital evangelist and activist. I was part of, and if you guess my age, I am going to be so upset with you because women are not supposed to tell their age. I was part of the Community Technology Center movement 15, 20 years ago, when we were building tech labs in communities just because we thought having access to Microsoft Office was a solution for economic inclusion. I was in this movement in Chicago when I met a woman by the name of Evelyn, who had 2 children, who lived in affordable housing, but we taught her how to read by ordering through Fingerhut online. I was in this movement when a woman named Doretha Hardin came to our tech center, who had lived in Chicago public housing for 25 years, And if you all remember this, we gave her a credential of what was called A+ certification. And she was able to move out of public housing and work for a security firm. I was working in this space when young kids started to realize the power of Encarta. That's how far back I go. And that was the only way on a 386 machine and a T1 or DSL connection that we could expose them to the power of the internet. And these were some of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Chicago. I went on to work for a group called One Economy, where we wanted to bridge the digital divide and bring public access to places where people lived in their homes. I remember going to the homes of affordable housing residents, bringing them a computer one week, and coming back the next week, and there was a coffee cup on the computer. And I would say, why is this coffee cup on the computer? They're like, well, we're not turning this thing on because we don't want them to see inside of our house. Because the risk of surveillance back 20 years ago was real. But then I still remember when those TSA jobs went online, and there were a flood of people that did not know how to get a job by putting their resume via the internet. That, to me, was the birth of the public service internet, when it became less of a luxury and a privilege and more of a necessity to ensure the human rights and civil rights of millions of people across this country. And if you fast forward 20 to 25 years to today, and we think about Uber and Lyft and all these other fascinating innovations, I would argue that some of those people are still sitting in the background. They're still in the margins, waiting to get online. They live in your communities. They are the ones that we're trying to figure out how to use technology to solve the problems, which is one of the reasons why we all got into this business in the first place. They're waiting for us. And when I share those stories, I share them within the context of what we know in research. Almost half of all American adults today report that the internet is essential, even when you break it down by race. But last year, the Pew Research Center reported that close to 14% of Americans in this country are still not online. They're disproportionately people of color, they're low income, they're seniors, they're rural residents, they're non-English speaking, they're people from tribal nations, they're people with disabilities. Data from NTIA complements this 14 million. That 14 million amounts, 14% amounts to millions. It's not 100,000. It's really the people that I suggest that are on the margins of the digital economy. Seniors, in particular, they tend to actually be adopters, but the poorer they get, the less likely they are to be online. When you looked at that chart, if we want them to age in place, we've got to bring them into the technology revolution. When we talk about the effects of not being online, more than 70% of teachers today assign work via the internet. But yet, we have the majority of low-income families who sit in the parking lot of McDonald's because there's no Starbucks for them to get free access. When we think about the 2/3 of Americans who stand no longer in the grocery store trying to get a newspaper, but trying to get online at the public library behind the 20 other people trying to do the same thing, the cost of digital inclusion is too high. The cost of us not doing anything is too high. I'm always reminded as a sociologist of Michael Harrington. I loved his work. If y'all remember, he wrote the story The Other America back in the 70s, where he talked about the fact that we underestimated poverty. Well, he was right. And we threw the War on Poverty program, hoping that we'd actually solve the bigger problem. Well, we still have poor people. I equate what we actually went through with The Other America, the same thing with the disconnected America that we're facing now. And if you all go back into the crevices of your mind and you think about your cities, think about those areas that have been hardest to serve, hardest to bring broadband to. It's not necessarily just because, it's hard to get fiber there. It's hard to get the marketplace to be competitive. Some of those people are also part of the mix of social issues that we're also trying to solve simultaneously. Whether it's educational, whether it's healthcare related, whether it's language, they are the other disconnected America. And we have to figure out what we're going to do to bring them online. And so with that, I tell people technology has the potential to solve the problems, to bring us closer together, to connect underserved and underrepresented communities to the world, their state, their city, their families, their caretakers, their school teachers, their employers, and even strangers of like-minded interest. I just joined as a secret meetup the other day. I didn't know there were so many people that were like me, kind of geeky, nerdy, and like technology stuff, right? But you can find them on the internet. And think about, again, the public side of this. A mother with an autistic child in an isolated community no longer has to be isolated in her quest for services. That's how powerful we're actually looking at when we look at technology. Now, Seattle, just to give it credit, is one of those cities who's been very progressive and aggressive in their efforts to refurbish computers, make internet access available through Access for All, and create private public sector partnerships. I know here in Seattle, Comcast Internet Essentials program is here, and they just celebrated a milestone of 4 million households that were actually served as a result of their program. Their program started in 2011. It's like the person on the side of the beach who's throwing out the seashells. It may not be the biggest impact, but it made a difference to that one family. We're going to see more and more of these public and private sector partnerships come in to help fill the gap. AT&T has one, Charter, T-Mobile, and other companies are lining up, I think it's Seattle CenturyLink, to actually make the call. But the challenge there, and I say this often when I talk to companies about digital inclusion, is throwing Post-it notes at this broad problem just brings back the fragmentation of the resolution and the solution. So we really need to think about ways to coordinate that. We've got much to do. But community by community, company by company, donation by donation, person by person, it's almost like healthcare. We've got to look at digital inclusion not based on the symptoms, but on the real challenge and the comprehensive nature of what it represents. Just this morning, I have to shout out this work. My great counterparts at Brookings just released a report on place-based access and subscription across the country. And what they basically argued was there are lower subscription rates in areas that are the most poor in this country. And they've got great graphics which show, places with the lowest census tracts have less competition, et cetera. We're in a stalemate. That data is not much different than a report that I did at a previous think tank, the Joint Center, where we went to some of the poorest communities in South Carolina and Los Angeles and found the farther away you were from the core, the less likely you were to have access. When I was in Chicago talking about those people, we had to scream to get DSL into that affordable housing complex, and we were only 2 miles from the city of Chicago, downtown. So think about those challenges that were before, they still actually happen today. And one of the findings that I thought was really important in that report is that they found that less than 1/5 of Americans live in a high subscription neighborhood where at least 80% of residents have broadband available. When you couple that with rural, we're sort of looking at a situation that becomes harder and harder to solve. And again, we can't claim in this country full broadband access if we leave some people behind. I've had the opportunity to go out into rural communities where they're challenged by telehealth or health services. I've seen the beauty of telemedicine where they can actually broadcast in a doctor. In South Carolina, they have a program called the Telestroke program that has basically saved the lives of people that are in the course of having a stroke. The minute they get to the doctor, they can broadcast in remotely. Been out to Alaska, where we've actually seen from Anchorage, the small remote islands around Alaska, where they brought in specialty doctors, dermatologists, et cetera, to help families figure out conditions of kids who have no way to get to the main core. But we can't do that without broadband. Think about our rural America, where those town hall main centers, they lack fiber and other assets to be able to bring the connectivity in, to bring them back into the fold of mainstream, to bring them the educational resources, and to ensure that their kids have the health and other public service provisions of the internet available to them. That stuff keeps me up at night, because as I think about this problem, I don't think about it in this binary way that we used to. Are we giving them devices? Are we giving them a phone? But rather, are we giving them a pathway towards a fulfilled life that allows them to benefit from the same things that we benefit in this room. That is so important as we look at the deprivation of internet access to underserved communities. And so I want to leave us with just 3 points. And again, I'm starting to feel like a Baptist preacher, but I don't care. Maybe at the end I'll pass around a collection plate and then you all can help my kids' college tuition, right? But I think it's important, particularly at this time when we're dealing with so many divisions of he said, she said, and my party, your party. Closing the digital divide is a bipartisan concern. There's no rocket science. The less that we do to solve that problem, the farther people fall on the margins, which means if we can't get them specialty doctors into their community, they're going to the emergency room on our dollar. Point blank. If kids in community cannot get access to laptops because they don't have the money for textbooks, it means at some point we're going to deal with that child at some point in the system because they're lacking the resources needed to be able to better integrate into society. Now, Chairman Pai at the FCC, I think, is beginning to take this issue on from a deployment standpoint. So I'm going to take out the people for a minute with Chairman Pai and just talk about what he's been trying to do, at least to get access into these communities. I mean, he recently deployed the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, BDAC, which I serve as one of the working group subcommittee members. They're looking at streamlining processes, poll attachments, where we actually have to do targeted resources, et cetera. He's just laid out for legislative review, because only Congress can do this, the gigabyte zone, which is actually going to be modeled after the empowerment zone money, which provides incentives for companies to come to communities. I wish he would have did that before Amazon selected their next place to actually sit. But the goal of that is to ensure that urban communities actually have access to incentives for build out, as well as private companies. But there's this other thing that he's doing that we want to see more at. And you can tweet me on this. He's got to do more on Lifeline. As a program, the FCC is a steward of the Lifeline program, which provides a discount to families who cannot afford it. If we go back and we think about Doretha and Evelyn and Paula and all those people that I mentioned, one of the basic reasons why they can't get online today is because they can't afford it. So $9.95 may not seem like a lot to us. I mean, I looked at my cable bill and my broadband bill the other day, and I was like, boy, we consume a lot of internet in this house, right? But I can afford it. But if you're a family living on a very menial budget for the month, we've got to ensure that they have access to the subsidy, and we've got to ensure that broadband gets into their home. Having a telephone is nice, but by a show of hands, how many people in this room actually pick up your home telephone? I think we all have it because we just can't get rid of it. I think that's part of the problem. Every time I want to get rid of my home phone, I go, but I need that phone to at least act like I have communication in my house, right? But we don't need it as much as we think we do. Wireless, actually, the FCC just released a report just yesterday saying the wireless marketplace is very competitive at this time and very healthy. And that says a lot, particularly for people who are cost prohibitive when it comes to having a residential broadband line. It's easier to get a phone than it is to actually have broadband within your home. But I would go further on the Lifeline program. Perhaps we should reconsider raising that subsidy so that we can make the choice for residents much more viable than what they can get for $9.25. And I'd go even further with regards to Lifeline. If we can get free Netflix and we can get free Spotify, why can't low-income people get free government services over their Lifeline program? No one has explained that to me, but it should be off the data cap, much like other services. I think, secondly, we've got to get into the conversation, and TOA, all of you in particular, we don't know where the infrastructure plan is going to go. I said in Washington, D.C., we're like a commercial. If you look at us long enough, you'll see a question mark on our foreheads, right? We have no idea. But what we know is happening right now is tax policy. But if we get infrastructure the way that we should, we need to raise the roof to ensure that broadband is included in the infrastructure plan. Right now, the people running that plan, they're really concerned about roads and bridges. But we're here to say, because we've seen it, they should be concerned about this next asset of broadband. Not just for intelligent infrastructure design, the sensors of the Internet of Things are going to require the type of support or subsidies that are a national imperative. So if we stay silent and we come back with a plan that not only has, pretty regressive tax policies on it, but also decides that broadband is not one of those areas that should be part of infrastructure, boo-hoo on us for not saying anything and how broadband is changing the way that our cities and our communities are working. So I'd urge all of you, because at the end of the day, the infrastructure plan will actually be driven by states and cities in terms of financials. Second, I would suggest that we recognize that closing the digital divide is all hands on deck. Back in the days, it was about, can I get a family Microsoft Office? Can I get them a device? Can I make sure they have digital literacy training? Can I ensure that there's a connection somewhere in their home? If we look at the comprehensive nature of digital inclusion, as I said before, it's no longer binary. It's no longer an option of whether we take one pathway. We need to begin to see rooms where agency officials sit across the room from each other, Department of Labor or labor officials, human service officials, the banking and community development officials need to come up with comprehensive digital inclusion plans. I was here when Earthlink approached the city of Chicago about developing municipal broadband network. I'll never forget that. My dear friend, Esther Joanne, Jim Baller, and others, at that time, Jim was across the aisle from me on that particular transaction. And I remember Earthlink at that time saying, we want to build this community network, but without taking into consideration that the city needed privacy safeguards in place. They needed to understand how it was going to be ubiquitous to all citizens, where it was going to be when it came to their public safety. I'd like to see more of those conversations, all hands on deck conversation about the future of digital inclusion. Many of you in this room are responsible for putting those plans together. I ask you to think about, when you have your meetings, is it just you and the CIO? Are you by yourself in that conversation? Are you bringing in transportation folks? Are you bringing in health and human services folks? Are you all trying to assess the value of bringing broadband to drive up the success metrics and drive away the silos when it comes to the future of broadband? We can't solve the homework gap if we have no educators in the room. We may get the kids out of the McDonald's parking lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the teachers are going to respect the fact that they're using it. You see what I'm talking about? So we've got to create an all-hands-on-deck strategy. And my last point is that the seismic weight of new technology in our society makes getting everyone online an urgent matter. We don't have any time to wait. I heard, I was telling Joanne, I like Thomas Friedman, the author, and so I heard him at the National Book Fair in DC, talk about his new book, which is around optimism, around acceleration. And I went and got the book. It's very large. These are getting very much worked as I read it because I have a book. But one of the things that he said that was just so enlightening is that he said all of this disruption has essentially led us to a point where we can't push pause. Let me say that again. All of this disruption has led us to a point where we can't push pause. The technology is not going to wait for us to consider the social welfare of others. Like I said, permissionless innovation, I deal with Facebook and all the high-tech companies all the time. They will do it and beg for forgiveness later. Oops, we didn't know that we were actually going to discriminate against a whole lot of people. If we'd have known that, we wouldn't have built it that way. Oh, we didn't know there was going to be a vulnerability in the system. And I appreciate what all those companies are doing because they've made my life much more efficient. But the challenge is we've got to recognize, how do we balance this urgency against the type of disruption that is changing the nature of how we live, learn, and earn? And we as practitioners and leaders within our community have to instill in ourselves that sense of urgency. We come to these conferences and we probably have heard this talk in other ways a million times. I mean, I've been talking about digital divide for like the last 20 years. Same question. I see people that I knew a long time ago. We all look the same. We all talk about the same thing, the same people. But we haven't solved the problem. And I think part of it is because, one, we've got to be all hands on deck. It's everybody's bipartisan issue. But we as stakeholders have to create that sense of urgency. So I wanted to share this quick story that I always find to be very hilarious. I'm a mother of a 15-year-old, pray for me, and a 10-year-old. 10, almost 11. And if you have a preteen girl, it's hard because they just do stuff that you don't understand. So last year, my daughter was in 4th grade, and she came home and she said, Mom, I want to run for class rep. And I said, that sounds like a great idea. She said, I've got the paperwork. I'm going to put it on the table, and I've got 3 days to get this paperwork done, Mommy. So I'm running for class rep. And I said, that's great. Whatever I can do to help you, you got it. Put the paperwork on the table. Get to it before the end of the weekend. This is Friday. Saturday passed, paperwork still sitting on the table. Sunday passed, she's at a play date with a friend. Monday, school. You gonna get the paperwork done? Oh, I'm gonna do it tomorrow. Okay. Tuesday, that paperwork's still sitting there, baby girl. I got it, it's not due yet. Wednesday, paperwork? Nah, not yet. Wednesday afternoon, I get this call from this crying 4th grader. Bobby, the paperwork was due today. And it's on the table, and I'm at school, and you need to call them. And I think this is very familiar to people who are parents. And tell them that you made a mistake, because you didn't know the deadline. I know you can do it. You did it before. I was like, yeah, that's when I did make a mistake, and I didn't know the deadline. That paperwork's been sitting there for a long time, right? So my daughter, and I find this to be very relevant to this conversation, she says to me, you're not going to call, and you're not going to back me up? This is important to me. I want to be the 5th grade rep, and it's the end of the year, and I missed it. And I said, well, you didn't do the paperwork, so, I did what most of us do, and I put on my big girl shoes, and I decided I was going to lecture my child, And she said, that's not enough. You don't understand. I only get one time to be the 5th grade rep. So at first I was feeling bad for her. One time to be the 5th grade rep. And I turned to my daughter and I said, but next year you'll be in 6th grade. You can try again, right? And she said, but you don't get it. There's only one time to be the 5th grade rep, and I missed the opportunity. I said, well, do you want to stay back? Because you can do it again. I said, you can start all over again. We can just put you back so you can be the rep. She's like, well, I would do that, but I don't think I want to do that, was basically her response. But I tell people that story because as a young 10-year-old, she got the urgency. There's only one time that I get to do this. One time that I get to run for this office. For all of us, there's only one time, one window, one opportunity that we can actually slow the clock of disruption on people who are falling further and further behind. One time for us to put together that digital inclusion plan. One time for us to walk across the hall and talk to somebody who's not in our department. One time to demand from our administration that we want broadband in the infrastructure plan. One time to say that Lifeline is a program that ensures that people get access to the internet. One time to share with our colleagues that we can solve this problem, that if we do nothing in this one window of time, we place them further and further and further behind. 14% of Americans are not online. And those are the people we need to care about the most, because those are the people where the cost of digital exclusion is just way too high, way too high. So I say to all of you, remember my daughter. I try not to remember all these stories every day because then I would get a headache. But that story stuck with me about the urgency of the work that we need to do in this field to build the quality of life for people that we think they deserve and they desire. Thank you very much, Nicol, for having me. Thank you very much. I think there were questions. Oh, come on up.
This is my first time coming up and asking a question during this conference. We have about half of our attendees here are on what we call the PEG side of our business, public education, government, programming, and production. And I'm just wondering, how can our PEG stations and our PEG programmers be a part of this conversation because sometimes we end up getting into our silos. But we do have community stations, and some of us still have public access services. So what are your thoughts and suggestions on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to actually leverage those resources. Years ago when I was at One Economy, we leveraged donations from the Ad Bureau. And we tried to come up with these commercials that would actually get people online. Now, back then, for those of us that can go back, we were just promoting get a computer, make sure that you're online so you can, get the internet. Nowadays, I think we can leverage those PEG channels to actually tell the story and the narrative for why we want people online. Show examples of people that were able to get jobs. I was just recently watching, and I think Microsoft is here tomorrow, a presentation from Microsoft where they showed a young man who, as a result of their new program, was able to get his email to apply to college, right, and do his college applications online, simply because they had an internet connection. I think those are the stories that we need to actually share with people, because the unfortunate thing is when you talk to most people, they're actually using the technology, but in many cases, they're not using it for the purposes of changing their lives, right? They're using it for music and to text and to do all this other stuff. But for the most part, we want to direct people as stewards of the public interest towards using the technology to improve quality. So I agree with you. If you have that ability, I would say begin to construct the narrative for your location and use real people where they've actually benefited from that technology. You will find many jewels within your community that can actually share that story in a very straightforward way.
Hi, my name is Dwight Williams. I'm with HTV City of Houston, and I'm one of those pigs. And the argument that there is people being left behind, I think, is an excellent argument. However, I think that there are levels of people being left behind. And I think that's associated with speed. So, what do you say about how people are being left at different levels of disadvantage due to speed?
Yeah, it's the Brookings report, and again, you can get that on the brookings.edu website that just came out. Talks about that the majority, 1 in 4 rural residents actually have access to a connection of 25 megabits, which is sad, right? Because that means that not only are they disadvantaged in terms of infrastructure, but speed as well. I think it's something that we need to actually look at very carefully. What is it that we need to do? In some cases, we may need to be technology neutral, right? There might be instances where a hybrid of technologies could actually work to ensure that we get access to more remote areas. But then the Brookings report also talks about within urban communities, there's disparities based on location, and it could be within miles or blocks away from each other. I think what we're seeing now, the latest statistics I saw, is we're actually seeing a 90% pass-over rate of some type of broadband connection. We need to now take the debate to the next level. And that's challenged. I mean, I'm not taking opinion either there because I'm at a think tank now. I'm not an advocate anymore, right? But, there are some pushback on whether or not we should have a defined speed for broadband access. And if you take, I did a chart recently where you have all the things that people can do on the internet. We have to figure out how to future-proof it so people can do those things. Because if not, based on your question, Dwight, people will be able to do 1 or 2 things and not be able to do the full breadth and scope of what the internet actually avails. But it takes time. Doing an automatic investment to ensure speed parity across the country is very expensive. And it's going to take some type of public-private sector partnership to build out what that capacity is. And investment, which is why broadband needs to be in the infrastructure plan.
Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Sorry, I'll keep a little of the metaphor going. You are, in a way, speaking to the choir.
You're right.
And we're very receptive to what you're saying. You touched briefly on the BDAC. And all of us, as you know, work in local government.
Yep.
Local government is not very well represented on the BDAC.
Yep.
And our greatest concern is that top-down advice from the BDAC will steamroll over our needs.
Right.
And for each one of us, small and large communities, we are worried that people will be left behind. What advice can you give us from the inside?
Yeah, I don't sit on the major working committee, but I do read the articles, and I do sense the tension between the current representation of the BDAC current, membership and others. I mean, I think it's important because this is a public sector open advisory committee for the public to chime in, right? When you actually see concerns or disparities based on the application of resolutions or language, to speak up. I mean, the BDAC has been meeting. I think I just found out they're only on a 6-month term in terms of so we ain't got a lot of time, basically, to do that. But I also think it's important to sort of all of us to come to the table. And again, this is where it's all hands on deck. We know on the technical side, and again, I'm a technology geek, in terms of enabling 5G wireless deployment, let's just say it is going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to see much more conversations at the table between state and local legislators and companies and government, right? We've got issues related to permitting, streamlining, which I think for everybody is going to be a problem if we steamroll through, like you said, using your language, right? Some of the deployments that are anticipated for advanced wireless services. Again, we've got to think about whether or not this is going to be something that is a mutually consistent goal for all stakeholders, or is it something that we're going to hold and then have, at the end, somebody try to steamroll over us anyway, right? Local legislators anyway, through preemptions. I tell people, I think this is a great opportunity for people to come to the table and talk about it. We had Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn come to Brookings to sort of lay out what she thought this process looks like. Clearly, having these conversations on how you balance the interests and needs of local communities with the broader technological goals, even with spectrum policy, are going to be imperative. And so for all of you that are sort of thinking about this fear and intimidation that you think you may encounter with this advanced deployment, I would say change the paradigm and come with some clear expectations of how it can also benefit you, right? Because the bottom line is we can deploy and the BDAC can come back with all this language, but if you all don't do it, it's not going to make it a very nice process at the end. And it's going to hold up the country really getting to the point where it wants to deploy the next generation of these technologies, which then contributes to that slide, which then forces the people that are still waiting to get online not to get access to higher speeds, which then goes back to Dwight's question, which continues the parity. To me, that's chaos because of digital sprawl, right? And so we've got to figure out ways to have much more collaborative voice. I do agree with you. And I would say for all of you, chime into the public comment period. This is a federal advisory committee that is supposed to also be responsive, so I'm certain when all the recommendations come out that there'll be a public period. And as an association or as individual government, you should chime in and sort of share what your opinion is, right? But know that it's inevitable. That's the unfortunate thing, because the technology is now the demands of technology are outpacing the infrastructure goals, right? And so that's where we're really, I can tell you from all of my conversations and our review of a lot of these issues, the capacity issue is really what's driving a lot of this expedient behavior to get to build out. Just because we're either competing against other countries or our consumers are basically driving the demand for more, faster broadband. Does that answer your question?
Very much.
Yeah. Other questions? I don't know all the secrets and where all the skeletons are buried, but I will share as much as I can.
I just have one more question. I hear what you're saying about the BDAC, but I just want to follow up. Is anybody on the BDAC fighting for making the universal deployment? Not simply, streamlining, we've done
Right.
streamlining, and it frankly doesn't result in any deployment in poor
Right.
or rural neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Is anybody in BDAC saying, we're not going to put obligations on local government unless it is all hands on deck and somebody's going to have to universally deploy? That's part of this model that comes out. Is that being worked toward or not?
I can't say what's going on in the other committees. I think my subcommittee is pretty well represented because I've heard that language, and there's been a lot of talk about different exemptions on smaller localities with regards to, deployment. But I will bring that back in my next meeting as a question for you. Just like any other federal advisory committee, there are 6 working groups that are actually part of this, and each working group is charged with a different perspective of it. But again, those public meetings are broadcast live, and I think it's important, again, to actually bring those questions out. people like me, we're not well represented as well on the academic side. So it's just one of those cases. But on my committee, I could just say that there are really good people who are practitioners in the field and representative of local government or local utility, that they're actually putting that stuff out there. Okay? I can only speak for my committee. But I want to keep saying that this is a hot debate, and I think it's one where, it's very important to understand the long-range planning and goals around this. So I'd love to, Steve, keep talking to you guys about that, because I think that there's a space to actually figure out ways that you can have a two-way conversation on this, given that the process is just not going to stop. And so we've got to inevitably figure out what's the best way to bring people to the table to have the discussion on where it's mutually exclusive, and you get to, I think what you were saying, beyond the utopian goals of full broadband deployment, right? And these other things, but you get to how you're not basically galvanizing other business models for the sake of something that's broader. That about what you were kind of saying, right?
No, I mean, I'm concerned that we have a major company, AT&T, that's been redlining in Cleveland, and we're now saying part of the solution is make local governments give away property without any money coming in to require these companies to build out areas they've actually neglected intentionally. If that's the ordinance that you're asking us to adopt, why should we adopt it? Why should we reject the process on the ground you say, because we are engaged in broadband?
Yeah.
And why aren't VDAC representatives saying it has to be a two-way street?
Yeah, and that's what I would say. We have very few company representatives on my subcommittee, but even the ones that are there, we have a balance of local representations. I can only speak for my subcommittee, but again, I think from what I have heard from the overall BDAC planning, and again, I'm not on the working group, is that all these concerns are being heard, and we just have to make sure they continue to be heard. Okay. Questions? Okay. Thank you. And I have to put in a plug. Please follow my work at Dr. Turner Lee on Twitter. And we're at Brookings. Again, please access this report on the brookings.edu website, and you can follow the blogs that we actually produce via our Brookings website. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
We tried to get Nicole here to our last conference, and she wasn't able to make it. But I think it's great that we tried and we got her this year, and I'm sure it was worth the wait for you to hear her remarks today. So once more, let's give a great round of applause to Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. And I know we're going to have the drawings, but it looks like Jody might have something else that we need to do. Or this is the drawing. Yay. Okay, great. And for those of you that have been around to the conferences before, I am horrible with names. So I will probably draw them, and I'm going to give the name pronunciations to Jody.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
When I was practicing criminal law, I would actually have clients that I could never pronounce their names. So I always referred to them as the defendant or my client. So I don't think that's going to work here today.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, so our first drawing is going to be for a, whoops, sorry.
Everybody in there.
Anybody else have one? Last call. The first one is going to be for a 2018 conference registration. Again, this is going to be in Philadelphia for next year. And if you think this conference is great, wait until next year. So, pressure on Mike.
Pressure on me. I have
Oh,
to pronounce the name.
yeah, God.
You pull it up.
I'll pull it out. Then you can dance.
Alvaro Calabia, City of Tacoma Park.
And we're going to give out a second one, which will also be a full conference registration for our 2018 Philadelphia. So here we go.
Joe Smith.
It's never that easy.
John Doe. No, just kidding. Cheryl Brothers, Fountain Valley, California. Cheryl, how many years have you been coming to our conference?
Okay, our next drawing is going to be for the Seagate 5TB portable storage drive for Mac and Windows, donated by Media Control Systems. I don't even know what that is. I should find out what that is.
Terabytes, 5 terabytes. Nicholas, I think it's Gadeo or Gieo, Eugene.
See, she couldn't do it either. Okay, next one is going to be for a $100 Amazon gift card from Tightrope Media Systems.
Melvin Riddick, City of Portland.
Was I supposed to do this in order? Okay, the next one is going to be for a Seattle swag bag from Visit Seattle, correct? Hurry! Oh, and you know why Tanya's out there looking for this bag? Why don't we give Tanya and Jennifer Harmon a big round of applause for all the work they've been doing? They're the two that keep this organization running, so.
I can pronounce this name, Reba Crocker, City of Milwaukee.
Okay, and our last drawing this afternoon is for a one-year Invictus streaming platform basic account with 100 gigs of storage and 150 gigs of monthly streaming bandwidth, donated by Invictus Media. Again, don't know. I have a degree in English, folks, come on.
And I'm from Minnesota, so I can pronounce Johnson, Anderson, all those names, but I'm doing my best. John Lixit, South Washington County.
And are we done? And we are now done with the drawings. We're done with our luncheon. We had a fantastic speaker. I hope you guys have enjoyed the conference up to now. We're going to have a fantastic event tonight at the Museum of Pop Art. Again, start meeting in the lobby at 5 o'clock. We're going to have all our board members out there helping direct you folks to the monorail. Bring your badge. There will be food, drink, Star Trek exhibit, all this kind of stuff. So it's going to be a fantastic night. Also, we're going to be down at the Seattle Center, so lots of restaurants to go to afterwards. Go up to the Space Needle and see the view. Enjoy Seattle. So again, thank you for attending today. Thank you again to Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee for her fantastic remarks. And your book will be out next fall. So look for her book next fall, folks. So thank you very much.